Liz.
I,
So let's just give it a second here to see if it warms up a little bit, and then we'll warn people about my technical issues. They're going to get tired of seeing them, but
can
and
people,
we are live. All right. Thank you, everybody. I'm Michael McCullough, and you're back for another episode of Peeks into the Past. Today, we're looking at tales of the life of Sojourner Truth. With me tonight, I have three amazing truth seekers. Liz Newmeyer, who is a local historian and author and professor and just wise about all kinds of stuff. We got Liz with us. Kimberly Hawley, who is the executive director of the Sojourner Truth Center for Liberation and Justice. Welcome, Kimberly. And one of her cohorts and one of mine, uh, Donna Rickman, who is a member of the board at the Sojourner Truth Center for Liberation and Justice, and a member of the historical board of the Historical Society of Battle Creek, where I'm also a member of the board.
yes,
Welcome to all of you. I had a long introduction. I was going to keep you here for 5 minutes just listening to me read, but I'm having some technical issues, and some of you may have figured that out already. My lips don't always match my speech. I think one of my colleagues did this just to keep me shut up for the evening. I don't know, but we have a lot of questions and a lot of slides, and it's been just a tremendous. It's been a tremendous experience for me myself. Having been here in Battle Creek for more than 20 years, I came here at about the time the Sojourner Truth Memorial was erected down there at the park, and I thought I knew the story fairly well. I'd been around a lot of wise people like Liz and like others to hear them talk, and but when we decided to do this program, I thought I needed to broaden my knowledge a little bit and read a lot of books about the life of Sojourner Truth. And it's really extraordinary um, to take her from her childhood in Ulster County, New York, where she was born a slave in 1797, through her ordeal in slavery and her spiritual awakening that led her to become an itinerant preacher, and then more and more an activist, and then a political force by the time she moved here to Battle Creek in 1856. And so I'm just really excited to share this story. I just want to remind folks that you can make comments on your Facebook or YouTube channels and ask questions, and we'll try to answer them as best we can. But I want to start with throwing it to Kimberly. And I think the broader question for all of us is what does Sojourner Truth have to tell us today? What are the truths that she has for us all? And so, Kimberly, I'm going to throw it to you first.
Absolutely. So, I was thinking about this, and, the obvious answer is, what Sojourner Truth advocated for is still so relevant generation after generation after generation. And I think in troubled times, we often look for symbols or figures of inspiration to help us, um, you know, model their path or to affirm our beliefs. Um, and just on a basic level, Sojourner Truth did extraordinary things for a formerly enslaved woman in the 1800s. And if you dig deeper past those extraordinary things that we often hear about, there's an incredible human story of personal liberation that I am so excited that we're going to be able to explore here today.
Well, I'm so glad that you're with us. I'm going to throw it to the rest of the panel. Why don't we go to Liz, and I'm going to just kind of advance the slides. Sojourner Truth. This is a wonderful image of basically her life's journey throughout the Americas, and you can see the breadth of her contacts and the people that she influenced. Um, what about you, Liz? How does Sojourner Truth speak to you?
um, her courage. I mean, consider the type of life that she had and what she overcame, and her religious faith. I don't think you can understand Sojourner without understanding where she was coming from in her Christian faith, that gave her the courage to do what she did. I find that she's a shining example. I don't think a lot of people realize what a mystic she was and how strong her religion was. They tend to think of her more as a speaker and not realize these other things. And I admire that.
Yeah, I mean, she really did lean on, in her book, Nell Irvin Painter often talks about her reliance on the supernatural. I don't know if that's another way of putting faith, but I mean, she was a mystic. I mean, she, God talked to her, and she had amazing powers of premonition, which we'll touch on a lot. How about you, Donna?
I like how she was just a self-made woman. I mean, she let the Lord literally use her from her childhood days and what she had learned from her mama Bet and Papa Bumfrey and just through the years and the challenges that she faced. She truly was a self-made woman for all centuries.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we're going to jump right in, and in this presentation, we really wanted to, as we talked about this over the past several weeks, we really wanted to give you, the viewer, and we hope this gets shared widely, an idea of Sojourner Truth, the person. I think we're all exposed to the symbol of who she is, but when you really dig deep into her life, um, a picture emerges of a very complicated person who was figuring things out the way, as they came, under extraordinarily wretched experiences. And so I wanted to just start with, in this slide, just kind of an idea of what her origins were like. And so, Liz, I'm going to start with you. What do we know about her earliest years?
Well, I think the first thing we can say is she really didn't have a childhood. She was not allowed to have one. She was forced into labor almost immediately. The Hardenberg son, who decided to take over, moved them out of their cottage. They had a system called cottaging, in which the people were given their own home and their own land. They didn't own it, but I mean, they could use all the proceeds from it and live off of it, and then they owed a certain amount of labor to their master. But he decided he was going to turn the house into a hotel. So from a very young age, they've moved right to the house. Instead of being allowed to stay separate in their cottage, at least, they're in the basement of the house, which becomes a hotel. So what is she doing as a child? I mean, she's emptying privies, she's changing beds, she's doing laundry. Basically, as I said, doing what would be involved in running a hotel.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Go ahead, please.
Well, fortunately, she did have both of her parents. So she wasn't separated from them. She did have her parents. She didn't have her siblings, except for one. She really didn't know the rest of her brothers and sisters that personally. And she did learn from her mother and father. I thought an interesting thing is that her father's parents were directly from Africa. So she learned much of that culture too, although she learned it all in Dutch.
Yeah.
She learned the Dutch language until she was about 9.
Yeah.
And
please go ahead.
Well, her parents, I think they were trying to prepare her, talked about how her brother and sister had gotten kidnapped or abducted. Basically, they were sold. I mean, I'll talk about this more later if you give me opportunity, but what happened once the Dutch realized that slaves were going to be free is they started selling the children, even though it was illegal, so they could make money. Otherwise, they were going to lose it all. The Dutch were they were not anti-slavery. They resisted the manumission laws as much as they could, but they weren't the majority.
Right.
Yeah. Of the population at all. And the Hardenbergs were extremely wealthy. I don't know if you want to go to the next slide that shows the Hardenberg house.
I do, but before we do that, I wanted to talk to Donna a little bit about Sojourner's grounding in faith, and how that informed her life. So, Donna, how did Sojourner learn about God?
She learned about God from her mother, Mama Bet. And it was during the time that after Charles Hardenberg had died, her mom became very saddened because she knew that the day would come that she would have to teach her kids about the auction block. But she always let them know that there was a God and that he lived up high in the sky. And she would also teach Isabella and Peter about the stars and the moon in the sky, that those stars and that moon were the same moon that all of their 8 to 10 siblings could look at, like they could look at. And that was something that could bring them together. But if they were ever mistreated or badly beaten, to go to God. And so I think just having that background, and as Liz was talking about, the African experience, because the mother was from New Guinea, her African experience, I think all of that together helped them to understand that there was someone that they could go to if their parents weren't there, even though they really did not know the realities of the auction block or slavery yet. They really didn't know.
And one of the things that really struck me about it was this incredibly personal relationship with God, with the Creator.
Yes.
Still at a very young age. I mean, slaves at the time, certainly not in the North, where they're far. You didn't have plantations with scores or hundreds of slaves.
No,
They're very
no.
small. So worshiping together wasn't something that was really available to a child, and so the other side of that is just a very personal relationship with God that again just endured throughout her life. Don't you think?
Yes. Yes. I think maybe some of the Juneteenth celebrations that they may have had could have alluded to God, but I'm not really sure.
Right. So this slide it gives you some geographical context about where Sojourner Truth was born in Hurley, in Ulster County, New York, and this was her birthplace, and we have this from esopus.com. It was owned by Colonel Johannes Hardenberg, but that's not who ultimately owned her before she was sold again. Liz, yeah, please tell us about the Hardenbergs. Who were they? And more broadly, as you alluded to earlier, the Dutch in New York.
Oh, yes. I'm an historian. I have to back it up to the 1600s because it was the Dutch that were the Europeans that came over here. The Dutch West India Company, or West Indies Company, I'm sorry, Dutch West Indies Company. They made a lot of wealth on the slave trade. They were a carrying trade, and including slavery. The Hardenbergs were a really super wealthy family. In fact, at one time, they owned several million acres of New York, even owned the Catskills. There's a town called Hardenberg, actually, in the Catskills, too. By the time we get to this generation, the land has been subdivided and divided, but the Hardenbergs are still pretty wealthy group. And generally speaking, they were not the ones that pushed for the freedom for manumission in New York.
Right.
They were quite most of their people that they owned. New York City was like the largest northern city. The next largest would have been Charleston in the South, that had that a larger percentage of slaves, many of them domestic, but you also had farming. A lot of them were free blacks that were skilled. The Dutch found it more advantageous to have skilled artisans, people at the sea, on the sea, sailors.
Right.
But anyway, the Hardenbergs were quite a wealthy family.
Yeah, I have a little inset there, and this came from one of Rutgers University's site. But Jacob Rutson Hardenberg, who was a cousin of Sojourner Truth's family's owners, he was the first president of Rutgers, and they have in the scores of places that we did research for this. That's one of the places I kept going to. You also see on the slide an inventory of Charles Hardenberg's estate that lists Isabella, her brother Peter, and her mother Bet, known as Mama. bet, and that was also at Rutgers University. So I'm moving on to the next slide. As long as my technology keeps working, we'll be good.
Yes.
So I wanted to jump to the first time that she was sold, and that is to the Schreier. I'm sorry, the Neelys.
Yes.
Kimberly, please. You see the home of John Neely up there in the on the left. Tell us about this.
Yeah, so when Charles Hardenberg died, his property was sold, and enslaved people were considered property or chattel. And so around the age of 9, Isabella was put on the auction block with a herd of sheep and sold to the Neelys for $100. And when I talk about this to groups, I often ask the audience to pause and think about when they were 9 years old, or think about the children in their lives right now that are close to that age, and what a traumatic experience that must have been for a young girl to
Yeah,
be removed from everything familiar, from her parents, put on this auction block. She was sold to the Neelys, who only spoke English and she only spoke Dutch. And because she couldn't understand them in their orders, they often beat her extremely harshly. Really bad. It was a very bad traumatic experience for her with
yeah.
the Neelys.
Sometimes with rods, and left her scarred really for life from those beatings. There's a
Yes.
there's a quote in the narrative, "Now the war begun," um, that alludes to this time. It was very difficult because all of her worst fears were realized. Right? I mean, she had always worried about being separated from what family she had, and then it came to pass. Um, but it didn't last long. Um, because of a fortuitous meeting, I would guess. Donna, what happened? How did uh, Martinus Schreiber come to buy Isabella?
Well, what happened was Isabella had a chance encounter with her father, and it was wintertime, and she was walking on the snow. Her feet were frostbitten. Different things were going on with her physically, and out of the sight of the Neelys, she showed her daddy her barren back. And because he had beat her with the rods out of the hot embers, those scars, of course, were in her back, on her back for the rest of her life. And she asked if he could find her a new owner. And he thought maybe she had been disobedient, and that's why she had gotten beaten, but she swore up and down she had not. And he said, well, I promise you, I will find you a new owner. And it just so happened because Martinus Shriver was a fisherman, and then also a tavern innkeeper, that he one day just, I guess, caught up with him and walked up to her and said, would you like to come with me and me be your new master? And she said yes, and she was very excited, and she left with him. And I think it was she was sold for $105.
Okay, I in the narrative, she remembers this time there somewhat warmly. I imagine relative to where she had come from, it had to be quite a relief. But
Right.
I just remember, because the work she didn't mind. She liked the river. She liked working in the tavern. Um,
Oh
and
yeah, she even came to know a few choice words, if you know what I mean. She came to curse pretty well, and she drank a lot of that beer and hops when she could get it.
yeah,
And there were a few other little things that she learned from them, because I heard there were some pretty rancorous people and like to curse and drink and smoke and do
uh,
different things like that. So she learned some different kind of habits with them.
yeah. I
But
was
she
just,
loved them. They treated her well. They loved
yeah,
her.
yeah. And so she was there how long?
Well, she was there from 1808 to about 1810. They talk about maybe a year and a half to 2 years. And then she went to John Dumont.
Right. And I remember reading in at least one of the books. I think it was Hertha Polly's book, and whether this was dramatization of the history or not, I don't know. But she described Dumont seeing Isabella working in the tavern, watching her, and then offering.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, you're exactly right. As a matter of fact, I think that might have been by Victoria Ortiz that may have
Okay.
documented that.
Right.
Right. Yeah, he's seen her and her height and the way she was built and how she got along with the people and thought, oh, I want her.
Yeah.
And then he offered to pay $300
Right.
to buy her. And Martinus Shriver, he needed a new boat, a fishing boat. And so he said, this is a good deal. I better take it while I can get it.
Right. Wow. And
And
so, I mean, yeah, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I was going to say that, I mean, this was really, I mean, this is where Isabella grew up, really. This was her family, and she navigated a lot there. So why don't we just talk? I know that we can't hit on every point in this program. That's the hardest thing about this program is we could probably go on for hours, but Liz would kill me. Um, but what were some of the things that she had to navigate there? And
uh,
maybe start with that dust up over the potatoes.
oh yeah, John Dumont. Oh yeah. It was between Gertrude and Katie, and Katie was the white bondservant. And of course, Mrs. Dumont preferred her over any colored or Negra uh, bo- uh, servant of any type. And so she had to fix the potatoes every day and boil the potatoes. And so she would scrub them down and put them in the pan and cook them. But for some reason, the potatoes were coming back black. And so Gertrude decided that she would kind of play a trick on Katie. And what she did was she watched her one day and she seen her put these ashes in the pot. And that's what had caused them to be blackened like that. And so she ran and told her papa, and that's what got Isabella out of trouble.
Hmm. Special relationship, but relationship with the entire family. You know, she and you mentioned Gertrude. Gertrude years later would recall that Sojourner was a bit of a hellraiser, so that kind of corroborates what you were just saying.
Yeah.
But so Isabella, as she was known at the time, I mean, she went through the things that all young people, young women, young men go
Hmm.
through. I mean, she fell in love. You
Yes,
talk a
she
little bit
did.
about that.
Yeah, she fell in love with Bob, and the sad part was he was a slave from the Catlin farm, a different farm. And as everyone probably knows, the mother, when she gives birth to the babies, it becomes the property of her owner. And so there are, at least what I have read, there are indications that there may have been a relationship, a sexual relationship between Isabella and Bob, and that possibly Diana may not have been her husband, Thomas. She was put together uh, to marry Thomas, but it's uncertain whether he really was the father. And then Carlton maybe talked about possible relationship between Dumont and Isabella as well, and that maybe all the rest of the kids weren't always his. Some may have been otherwise.
Right. And that was, you know, you know, terribly so, but very common for slave owners
Right.
to take advantage of of what they considered their property in that way.
Exactly.
But I also wanted to. You mentioned before about her the closeness of her parents to African traditions. Isabella developed her own means of worshiping um, while she was there. That place in the Willows, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean that she constructed a place where she could be alone and talk to God.
And talk, yes, and talk to God. As a matter of fact, she was to the point where no matter where she was, she would find a place where she would go solely to talk with God and have her talks with God.
Right. So, and you mentioned John Dumont. I think one of the things that's so fascinating about this story is that she maintained a relationship with Dumonts for the rest of their lives, Um, in the narrative and in other writings, I mean, she refers to Dumont as godlike, um,
Yes.
and she adored him, right?
Yes, she felt he was God, literally God. Yes.
What?
And she did adore him, and sadly enough, a lot of the slaves called her the white man's Negro
Right,
because they felt that she gave her life to Dumont and was doing extraordinary work, amounts of work that they didn't want to have to be doing, but she was making it look bad for the rest of them.
right, right. But and Kimberly, you and I have talked about this too. I mean, Demont, whether she adored him or not, he was the owner. There certainly are a lot of at least suggestions that there was sexual relationship there, which in my book is rape. Um,
Mhm.
Accusations, or at least some theories about sexual abuse at the hands of Sally Demont. Um, but inconsistent. I mean, she was beaten by previous owners too. I mean, what what is it? How did being an abused child affected the way that she moved in the world? That she chose her relationships?
I think that's again a part of this complex story that is Sojourner Truth. Um, Certainly, with the level of trauma, physical, emotional, sexual abuse that she experienced throughout her life, enslaved as an enslaved person, would certainly lead to um, many symptoms that are common with children that have been abused. Attachment problems, interpersonal problems, physical, mental. Certainly, I can't speak to specifics with any authority, but in my interpretation, this really speaks to the resilience um, of this individual, given all that she endured.
Yeah,
Um, and I echo the comments earlier. I do believe her faith played a large role um, in that.
yeah. So, so she was with the Demonts for what, 16 years? Was that about right?
Yeah, that's about right.
Yeah. And so I want to talk about the walk to freedom. But before I do that, her walk to freedom, I want to talk a little bit about why it took so what the state of slavery. And you alluded to this earlier, Liz. The, New York's first statute addressing abolishing slavery was passed in 1799, but it took a while.
Right. And as I said before, New York was the second to the last northern state to free the slaves. New Jersey was the last, and they didn't do it until the 13th Amendment was passed. I mean, I don't think about northern states because so many of them did not allow slavery, although sometimes there were ways around that.
Yeah.
Um, one thing that happened in the American Revolution is there were many African Americans who joined the Patriots. There were an equal number that joined the British. In fact, the British
Yes.
actually had to repatriate about 3,000 of them to Canada when the revolution was over because they had sided with the British. But on the other side, you have the ones that sided with the Americans, and they were felt that that should be repaid. Plus, except for the Dutch, keep in mind that most of the New Yorkers felt it was a stain on their state to have slavery. They objected to it, and it was the Dutch citizens that kept fighting not to have freedom. So it took some time before the law was passed
Yeah.
um, to for the slaves for this law that came forth
Right.
with
Yeah.
the
It's we see.
children. It didn't really release the actual law, didn't release any slaves, but it would eventually release the children.
Right. Right. Well, and it's just consistent with what we see today. I mean, powerful powerful segments of society doesn't give up their power that easy, doesn't give up their
No.
wealth that easy, and there was a lot of concern about not robbing these wealthy slave owners of their wealth,
Mhm.
and so it was a series of compromises and a series of delays, and as you said, matched to age. But eventually it did happen, and it was scheduled to happen in 1827. But um, Isabella didn't wait that long. She had a breaking point. Donna, why don't you talk a little bit about what happened there?
Right. She had the breaking point because she had been promised by Dumont that if she would be a good slave, if she would be a faithful slave, if she would be an obedient slave, uh, that he would release her early. And so she promised that she would spin uh, bunches of wool, you know, take in the crops, just do all this extraordinary work. Like I said, that the black slaves looked upon her and felt disdain, against her. But even her husband Thomas said, he's just fooling you. There's no way he's going to let you leave a year early. But she believed that he was God and that his word was real and everything that he stood for was honest, until the time came of her to go to him and ask for her freedom that he had promised. And then at that time, he told her that no, uh, because she had an accident with a scythe with her finger and cut part of the finger off. And then she had given birth to baby Sophia, that she had taken away time, doing her chores and household duties and everything else, and that he could not relieve her, that she had to stay on. And so she decided, it's like she had an epiphany, awakening, and she decided, no, no, that's enough. I've had enough. And she decided she was going to take her freedom with her baby Sophia. And so one morning at the break of dawn, not during the night because she was too afraid, and not during the day where she could be seen, she decided that she was going to leave the Dumont farm and find her freedom. And so she met up with a Quaker, and he directed her onto the Van Wagoner family, Isaac and Maria. And from there, they took her in. And actually, when Dumont came and found her and wanted to take her back, different things happened at that time. But he ended up paying $25 for her freedom and $5 for Sophia's freedom.
Yeah. One of the things that was so extraordinary about it is the terms that she left. She left on her own terms.
Yes.
She made the decision, but she wasn't going to leave John Dumont in the lurch. She committed to spinning 100 pounds of wool. And she got it done. Yeah, and she didn't go very far because she didn't want him to have to travel very far to go look for him.
Yeah, she was a good and faithful and obedient servant. And based on what her parents had told her, going back to her upbringing with Mama Bet and Papa Bumfrey, she stayed true to her word pretty much until that day.
Yeah. And so, as you said, I mean, she made her way to the Van Wagenen families. I've seen it Van Wagoner and Van Wagenen both ways. But and this is open to anybody. I mean, he refused to let her call her master. And so that would have been her first experience. I mean, what must that have been like for her? I mean,
well, he only knew. Yeah, he wanted her to know that the only master was a master to all people, not just to white people, but to slaves and anybody. And their master was their God in heaven for everyone.
Right. And so that was a big victory. But not long after that, she was learned of her sons being sold illegally to the South. Liz, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, what I said before is that started happening quite a bit because the Dutch owners thought, their greed got the better of them. And even though it was illegal, they would sell the children off because if they waited, the children would get their freedom. Mm-hmm. And they would be out, whatever the value was, the slaves. So this was not unique. What was unique, though, is Sojourner fought it and was eventually able to get him back. That was different, but unfortunately, it was happening. I didn't realize this when I first learned this story, and then I read that later, and I thought, oh, I can see that happening. They're going to try and get as much money out of these children as they can and not let them stay in New York and get their freedom. And so even though it was illegal, it happened, it happened all the time.
Yeah. Well, and she was just adamant, and this is a quote of hers, I'll have my child again. She went back to DeMont, actually, to seek help, I believe. And she did go looking for help. But she didn't get any help there. Where did she get the help? Anybody?
She got it from Quakers and different people that helped her along the way, and sent her to different squires or attorneys, and that's what helped her to eventually get her son.
Right. And then when she did, and I don't think we've mentioned it. I mean, she was the first African American, male or female, to prevail in courts. Am I correct in that?
Yes.
Yeah. And there's a monument there. But after getting her son, and that was kind of rocky. Her son was very traumatized. He was just how old? 5 years old at the time.
Yeah, 5 years old.
Yeah, and was scared stiff. At first, denied his mother.
Exactly.
But she was able to prevail, and she did prevail in court. And then she got a look at him, and this quote: "God render unto them double." What happened next, Donna?
Well, part of the problem that came into that was that when she had gone to the Dumonts, this was way before even going to the Quakers and getting, her son back. His wife had made the comment that she already had enough little Negroes under her. So, why should she worry about one more or something like that? And then it turned out that her daughter ended up marrying Fowler, who was the man from the South that got Peter. And then what he ended up doing was killing her daughter. And not Sojourner. Isabella says, God render unto them double, but she certainly did not mean that death should come to their daughter. Oh God, that's too much. I didn't mean quite so much, God.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is a theme that comes up a lot in her life. I mean, she's pretty hard on herself when she feels like that she is transgressed or that she has. Plus, she also had this just incredible faith that if she asked God for something, God was going to deliver it, and so she blamed herself.
And that went against what her mom and Papa Bomfrey had told her. They taught them to be honest, right. and to be loving and caring. And really, that was a spiteful, vindictive, almost hateful attitude that Isabella took on, which was not of her upbringing.
Yeah. Now, and then after all of this, and Kimberly, I want to go to you, but after all this, she's planning to go back. She's planning to go back to the DeMonts, and perhaps part of the draw is that she has children there who are slaves that she had to leave behind. I don't know, but she's thinking about going back. What happened next?
Yeah, and I just wanted to comment on kind of, what we've described in terms of her leaving and having to leave her children behind. And again, for me, that gets to that human element that makes it relatable to any person that's had to be separated from their child, whether it was to go somewhere to make a better way of life and leaving a child or children with relatives while they did that, or that for other reasons were separated from their children. And just the inner conviction that she had to be, forceful in getting her child back. It's just so powerful to me. So I just wanted to comment on that. But, you and I have had conversations about, internalized oppression and um, the misery that um, can sometimes draw you back when you're making a huge change in your
Yeah.
life. And this is just me, my interpretation of her experience. So those are some reasons that I think about when I think of why she would have even considered returning to the Dumont family, for
Yeah.
sure.
And I don't know the research.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I don't know the research on this totally, but I mean, there's also what they call the Stockholm Syndrome, that they noticed later, that people go back to their oppressors because it's familiar, I guess. And if they act halfway decent, they think, well, I'll be okay. I mean, because they're so disoriented by that time, by their experiences, that it's hard to think.
Right. She supposedly also went back because she missed the celebration and the reunion of the family and friends that she had back there, and felt like, I want to be in on the celebration and see the family again.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we know today, research tells us that traumatized children crave structure, and they crave the structure that they know. And so that had a lot to do. But something stopped her. Kimberly, can you talk a little about what stopped her? Or Donna, or Liz, anybody. But you're on my slide, Kimberly, so I'm asking you.
That's funny.
Well, we've touched on it throughout in terms of her relationship with God. And, there's a quote, he gave me a look, referring to God, that stopped her.
Yeah. Yeah. Almost as if, and I think it was written later that, or somewhere I picked up later, that just this idea of, God didn't want her to go back and be somebody else's property. That's what wasn't what he looked at. But it was still, it was shortly after that she was overcome by another vision. Donna, do you want to talk about that?
Well, I know that there was a big light that took her out, and it was to the point where it seemed like the trees were waving in all their glory, and that the stone shone like glass, and it was a very rude awakening for her that set her back, and I think almost knocked her out.
Yeah, and she interpreted that as a vision of Jesus, right?
Yes. Yes, coming between her and God. Yes.
Between her and God. And that's the way she always described him, Jesus, from then on.
Yes.
And what did that mean to her? And I put up this quote from Painter's book. It must have been incredibly empowering for her at that moment in her life. The assurance of her sanctification released Isabella from the crippling conviction that she was nothing.
Yes, I mean, you have a powerful vision.
Yeah.
And before, most of your other experiences tell you were nothing, even though you worked hard to satisfy Dumont, and on and on and on. That the fact that God looked at her, that is through Jesus, and her back. I mean, that had to be, I can't imagine. I mean, that certainly had to be powerful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
And that's just I mean, maybe we all have these in our lives, but you just keep coming across these huge transformative points in her life that kind of lead her to the next, often out of sorrow, often out of a sense of loss or being lost.
And that's what I was going to say. She didn't have her parents' assurance anymore. They were, because sadly enough, they died all the way back when she was on another farm. I mean, it was ridiculous. So she didn't have them for that assurance that she was somebody.
And so at that time, there was, I can't remember the name of the woman in her life that encouraged her to take Peter to New York City to be educated.
Mrs. Gere.
That's right. That's right. Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.
And so she was making her way to New York City, of all places. And I wanted to talk just a little bit. This was a time of the Second Great Awakening, and a lot of poor people, black people, wealthy people were caught up in that. And so, Liz, could you just kind of give us a sense of the landscape at the time?
Well, the Second Great Awakening was a revival movement. In fact, one of the stories, this comes later, that New York had so many revivals that it was called the Burnt Over District because it was set on fire so many times. And it happened along the Erie Canal, because obviously news could travel faster there. You're not talking about the internet or Facebook at that particular time. You're talking about news traveling fast along the Erie Canal. The Second Great Awakening was different from the first one in that there was an emphasis on individual salvation. Calvinism and predestination was big before, but now Charles Finney, who was the chief minister, said each of us can work to save ourselves. Now that may seem logical to us now, but it wasn't then. And so this was a new way of looking at salvation. And when Jesus said in his Sermon on the Mount, "Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect," there was a movement called perfectionism. Not perfect the way we would think of it, but perfect in the sense of being spiritually mature, and that you could do that. And the interesting thing about it was they thought if enough people did it, it would hasten the second coming of Christ. I mean, there's a lot of stuff mixed in here in the Second Great Awakening, the return of Christ. You had ecstatic worship. The Methodists, I guess I should distinguish here. You had a Methodism that was outside the formal Methodists. In fact, in most textbooks to distinguish it, they refer to it as primitive Methodism, and that is that they lived, you could live simply through the power of the Holy Spirit. You could attain perfection through the power of the Holy Spirit. And the primitive Methodists encouraged visions. I mean, they did not see this as peculiar. And furthermore, they didn't see it as peculiar that it happened to women, not just men, but that it happened to women. And so they took Sojourner at her word for her visions. They didn't discourage her. Whereas the established Methodists, although they let blacks into their church, they segregated them. And so did the Episcopal Church. So at that time, eventually they broke away. They formed the Zion African Methodist Episcopal churches. And that became, in fact, we have one in town. I mean, they became a whole different branch in response to segregation. But anyway, the religious enthusiasm, now that wasn't shared by everybody, but temperance, anti-slavery, women's rights, it's just started spreading out to all these different kinds of social issues too. And Sojourner took up those causes herself.
Yeah, and when she converted to Methodism, I mean, that's when she really adopted the dress style that we still see later in her life. Is that right? I mean, that was part of her conversion and part of her acceptance into that community. In fact, she went seeking the Methodist community when she went to New York.
Yes, but this Methodist community was sort of outside the norm. I mean, they weren't the established Methodists, if you will. But Sojourner, she took up dress reform, but she didn't take up dress reform the way that most women did, but rather that all this dress was extravagant and prideful. It was not proper to that. Her image of God is that she would dress simply. So she looked at really the Quakers. I mean, when you look at her dress, it's what she tried to think was a simple form of dress that would be acceptable to God.
Right.
And the Quakers were a guide. She never did become a Quaker, but the Quakers certainly played a major role in her life.
Absolutely. I wanted to talk a little bit, first she went to the John Street Methodist Church, a segregated church where she wasn't comfortable. And then she went to the African Methodist Episcopal Zionist Church. And Kimberly, she had a reunion there with some siblings. Can you describe that?
Yes. And I would actually have to call on my peers because I know that she encountered them at that church. but I can't relay that experience of what that was for her.
Yes, she did have some experiences there. Um, it turned out that she ended up meeting up with her brother Michael and sister Sophia, who were the ones who were back when the parents were with the Hardenbergs. They were sold to a slave master and put on a sleigh and taken away. And so she found out about them. But what was really mind blowing to me was the fact that she looked back into her life even further, and she had a relationship with a woman that was also her sister. Uh, and she said she should have known that that was her sister, because when they go to the altar, she would feel the boniness of her hand.
Yeah.
And then she says, and oh yes, she did remind me of Mama Bet.
Yeah.
So that was Nancy. So that was truly an experience for her.
Yeah, I was struck by that too. I mean, Michael, she knew as very, very young, but that far
Yes.
along to recognize, um, extraordinary. And of course, they had a reunion, and sorrowful too. I mean, had to lament a life missed, and this is a quote from Sojourner Truth: "O Lord, what is this slavery that can do such dreadful things?" There's a quote much later in her life that I read along the lines of, um, how God had somehow shielded her from just how horrible her situation was when she was living it. And she gives praise to God because had she really fully realized how terrible it was, she could have never have survived it.
Yes, she and her family and the slaves, period, would have been beclouded and crushed.
Yeah.
Their mind could not have taken it.
So we move into this like really interesting, scandalous time in Sojourner Truth's life, and obviously informative. I mean, that's we're all the sum parts of everything we've experienced, but this is outside the pale of most of our experiences. Um, Matthias, can you tell us a little bit who about Matthias was, Liz?
Yeah, his name was Robert Matthews. And at different times, he literally thought he was God or that he was Matthias. Matthias was the disciple who replaced Judas Iscariot. He thought he was actually Matthias. Well, he convinced enough rich fellows that his idea of a commune was worthy, and they gave him a lot of money. And Sojourner joined. She I think she believed that he was what he said he was, that God. And Sojourner seemed drawn to communes. I think she was drawn to a sense of family or some kind of sense of belonging, especially if identified with God.
Yes.
With religion. And communes were fairly popular right then, these different groups. But Matthias turned out to be a little questionable,
To say the least.
Yes, to say the least. And so in the long run, he was a ladies' man before he decided he was God, and it didn't seem to leave him. This is kind of a familiar story, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And eventually he's accused of murdering one of the fellows who gave him money because he coveted his wife. And then Sojourner gets sucked into all of this.
Well, she was implicated in the death herself.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know how much we can cover. I mean, there's so much that happened in this period of time. But Donna, what stands out for you in the experiences there that you think our viewers would like to hear?
You're speaking of as far as Sojourner with Matthias?
In the kingdom, yes.
Oh, in the kingdom. Well, what got me, I just have a few notes here, but there were so many deplorable acts that were occurring in the household, and they worshiped him like he was God on earth, and he used all of the parishioners' money for the sake of the kingdom. and he employed Isabella's housekeeping services for free. And then the biggest thing was that he engaged in wife swapping. In other words, interpreting that as matching the spirits. Okay. So, yeah, wife swapping. And then they had communal bathing.
Yeah.
So where the kingdom come from, I don't know. Kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
Yeah.
Yeah, that reminds me of Jim Jones and all these other cults that have come along. That, and I'm sorry Sojourner got sucked into it, but I think it was her desire always for family, for belonging.
I think so too. But and also, again, Painter writes about her loyalty to Matthias through all of that turmoil.
Yes.
When he was accused of murder, she testified on his behalf. She sought legal advice again from John DeMott. She would have gone with him afterwards, I think, or I should say, Painter thinks. She's more the scholar than I am. But again, that loyalty. And
anything that spoke about God, she was on board. I mean, you say the word God, and she jumped on it. She really did.
Mm-hmm.
This was also the time, I think, worth mentioning that she had so much trouble with Peter, her son, Donna. Correct?
Right. She did have trouble. He was doing all kind of things that he shouldn't have been doing in the city of New York, and he was getting caught up with bad crowds and was in and out of jail, and she was bailing him out all the time and so forth and so on. So she caught up with this black barber, Mr. Williams, and he knew something about the Nantucket whaling ship, and he thought he could get him on board to, go to sea. And that's what he did. And so for about 3 years, she heard from him. And then after that, she did not hear from him anymore, thinking that he may have been lost at sea.
Yeah. And there's so much that we could uncover, and we could be here a long time, but
me, I'll tell the story.
I know you will, and I enjoy hearing it every time.
Okay.
But one of the things that this was an incredible, again, disillusionment. And you mentioned Peter, and Peter did ship off on a whaler. He was eventually lost at sea. And in the aftermath of all of this, Sojourner was reflective on what he was pursuing and then what she was pursuing. And this quote has just always just struck me as so poignant and so meaningful. And again, one of those revelations that put her on the path that eventually led her where she went. And she was reflecting on the fact that someone gave her money to hire somebody to clean the streets and steps of snow. She would just get up early, pocket the money, and do it herself. And she was confronted by an individual who would have wanted the job and said, "I need that money to feed my family." And she goes, "I got my own people to take care of." But on reflection, she was pretty hard on herself in this quote: "The rich rob the poor, and the poor rob each other." Kimberly, how did this revelation affect Isabella and who she became?
I sound like a broken record, but that's okay, because for me, this really is a human story of personal liberation. And, this, when you attach your identity to a group or a person or a relationship, and suddenly everything you thought was true is not, or it's taken away from you. That's a jarring experience. In my culture, that sometimes means you have to have a come to Jesus kind of talk with yourself and or others. But just on a human level, this could be when someone hits rock bottom. This could be when someone questions everything they thought they knew or their purpose.
Yes.
And I think, for her, I think, again, just like, the experience we described before, you had the quote up. Oh, I can't remember exactly what it said, but for me, that was her starting to understand a bit of her self-worth. And
Yeah.
here, this right here is another pivotal point for me in terms of her own journey and evolution, understanding, starting to reflect on her experiences and how what has been done to her, she has internalized and sees that she's doing that to others in some way. And then again, just having something that you've attached your identity to, totally totally taken away, that rocks you, and you have to reflect on, where do I go from here? Who am I? And what is my purpose here?
Well, and anybody else can chime in on this point. One of the things that strikes me also is that when she is really let down by someone that she trusted, she ends up turning around on herself. I mean, she ends up turning around. I mean, I'm not saying she's blaming herself for the other person's conduct, but she digs deep into her own who she is and what she could be better, what she could do better, how she can be a better person. This quote has just stuck with me since I read it the first time. So then we get to the point in June. What was the date? June 1st, 1843.
Yep,
Day of the
1843.
Pentecost. Yeah, and that's when. I'll let Liz tell the story of the significance of the day, and then Donna, I want you to talk about a little bit of what was the significance of the name. But Liz, why is that such a significant day?
Well, Pentecost is a significant event in the Christian, in the early Christian church. It actually goes back to a Jewish tradition or a ceremony, and Penta means the 50th, and it was the 50th day after Passover, and the Jews would celebrate the harvest, and it also came to honor a God for giving them the Torah, that is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, for giving them the law. And so all the apostles were in Jerusalem, and along with the early Christians, and they were worshiping together, and a wind came and flames came on their head, and it was the presence of the Lord and the gift of the Holy Spirit. The gift of the Holy Spirit was given to the early Christians, giving them the power to go out and evangelize. They could speak. Most biblical scholars don't interpret it as speaking in tongues, but rather speaking different languages of the people, so that they could carry Christianity forward. So for Sojourner, which this has happened to her before, actually. I don't remember if I read this in Nell Painter or not, but between the time that Peter was sold and she gets him back was a Pentecost date too.
Yes.
So it has double significance to her that the Holy Spirit she is filled with the Holy Spirit, and it gives her the power to go forward and become a preacher.
Wow. And Donna, the significance of the name.
Oh, sojourner, that means to go from place to place and stay a short time. And then the truth, to tell the truth of God and help the people to learn about their sins.
Yeah. So she starts, and this is a rough drawing of where she starts on Canal Street there in New York City, heading to Huntington, on up back over to in Connecticut, and on up. Liz, in her narrative, the Reborn Sojourner Truth said that the Spirit called her east, but what was happening there, and I guess it's kind of an extension of what we were talking about before with the burnt district and other things, but what was going on there? And in that time, itinerant preaching wasn't all that unusual, right? It was something people did and were accepted in the communities.
Mm-hmm. Well, the reason she went this direction, I think, is that first of all, Long Island was very rural, and I know we'll get to them later, but this was where Hicks came from, the Quaker man who established what was called the Hicksite Break or the Hicksite Rebellion. There were more camp meetings out there. You've got Northampton. You got more friendly people, and actually a lot more African people of African descent
Hmm.
in these different areas that were free. And so I think it just drew her. I mean, God told her to go, but I mean, I think this was part of the logic, that she was going to a place, areas that were friendly to itinerant preachers, friendly to the Second Coming, friendly to communes.
Yeah. And she was very well received. I have a quote up there of Henry L. Bradley of Bristol, not Briston, in a letter to his sister Dean in Hartford. I send you this living messenger as I believe her to be one that God loves. Let her tell her story without interrupting her and give close attention. You'll see that she's got the lever of truth, that God helps her pry wherever few can. Very, very warmly received by individuals who may not have seen her as orthodox with their own faith. Right? I mean, they were very open to hearing alternative points of view, at least hers, Liz, or anybody else.
Yeah, these particular groups were, because remember, they're looking for truth. And here comes along someone who's doing the same thing, and her name is Sojourner Truth. They're friendly to itinerant preachers. So they were, this is not organized religion, which would have been a lot more controlling.
Right. And they were open to women speaking.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Not everybody was. I mean, but this was she was going to a friendly area.
So I'm having trouble advancing my slide here. There it goes. And I think it's important to talk about. And I love you reading this quote because number one, you pronounce the names correctly, and I don't. But Liz, but the Millerites. I mean, tremendous influence. Talk a little bit about who William Miller was, and they influenced more than just Sojourner Truth in Battle Creek. Another religious movement came out of that.
Yes, William Miller was a farmer who became a preacher. And he was convinced, actually, this was back in the 30s already, he was convinced that he knew when Christ was going to come again. But he didn't say anything at first. Now, keep in mind that the Second Great Awakening, this whole idea of Jesus' second coming was a powerful concept. It didn't start with Miller. I mean, sometimes they make it sound like Miller's the only one that ever thought of this. No, this was a I don't know where the word popular is right, but it was a consuming idea that somehow Jesus in Christ, the second coming. I mean, all Christians believe in the second coming. They look at different details about it, but these particular groups thought the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation contained hints that if you could figure it out just right, you would know the exact day. And I've forgotten now, it was 1843 and 44. He said God was going to come, Jesus was going to come. They're up on the hills. People sold all their property. They're waiting, and nothing happens. So people just write him off. But the idea of the second coming being imminent does not go away. Two groups, actually, two large denominations come out of this. The Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, more popularly known as the Mormons, and the Seventh-day Adventists. Now, they combine other things that were popular then, too. I mean,
sure.
That's a story in itself. But so the notion of trying to figure out the second coming was very popular thing. And then even though people got disillusioned with Miller, that didn't mean they gave up the idea.
Right.
And I mean, Sojourner believed in that too. I love this quote because Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, she knows her audience. They were the three men in the fiery furnace.
Yeah.
And the Nebuchadnezzar said, "You have to bow down to me." And they said, "No, we're not." These were Jewish. We're bowing down to God. So he puts them in the fire. Nothing happens. He notices there's another presence there, and he realizes, whoops, their God is protecting them, and and interestingly enough, when he releases them, he makes them part of his government. But as everybody knows at that time what Sojourner is talking about. First place, they know who these guys are. And secondly, she has been through the fire.
Right.
She understands. She's been in the fiery furnace. And the metaphor, she's certainly been in the fire. of being a
Amen.
slave.
We're going to have some church up in here. Amen.
Well, and, again, it's just extraordinary her knowledge of Scripture for someone who didn't read. It's only ever been read to her, and that she quotes it so fluently.
What was interesting to me is she didn't like adults reading the Bible to her. She liked children, because if she asked the adult to repeat it, then they'd start throwing in their own interpretation, where the child would just reread it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So she wanted to hear it uninterpreted.
Yes.
So this comes up on a really incredibly pivotal time again in Sojourner Truth's life, and that's when she was referred to. She was looking for a place to winter, and she ended up in Northampton. So Kimberly, talk a little bit about what she found there, and why she stayed.
Yeah, this was utopian abolitionist community, and I believe their source of income was a silk factory, a communally owned silk factory.
Yes.
But in terms of this abolitionist community, I think maybe this was the first time that she experienced a sense of equality and a freedom of speech. And she also met other abolitionists such as William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and others.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, as you mentioned, again, another pivotal time in terms of, Liz mentioned the Second Awakening. I think this was an awakening for Sojourner Truth as well, just in terms of systemic racism and oppression.
Yeah. I think you may have touched on it already, Liz, but there were so many communal communities at this particularly in this really compact period of history. Why? Why were these flourishing so much? They'll die pretty quickly.
Well, historians keep trying to answer that. The only one that makes sense to me is that they become more popular when the social structure is changing rapidly, and it was changing rapidly. America was becoming less and less rural and more urban. People were moving off farms, they were working in factories, and they were looking, there was a larger middle class, they were looking for some kind of sense to the world. I remember when I was in college, you had a bunch of commune-minded people back in the 60s, too. This comes and goes historically. I don't have any sensible explanation for it. Or for their demise either. I just think of the Animal Farm when it says George Orwell has this one character say, all pigs are equal, but some pigs are more equal than others. And so, these communes fell into the same kind of a problem of human relations that any group does. They couldn't sustain them. It's very difficult to sustain them.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and for whatever the reason, Sojourner Truth seemed to fit in well there.
Mm-hmm.
And Don, I wanted, and of course, this is where she met Frederick Douglass. She met a lot of luminaries there, but she met Frederick Douglass. Donna, talk about that relationship. I have up a couple of quotes that I think are kind of really encapsulate it very well.
Okay. Well, knowledge is the direct pathway from slavery to freedom, is what he said. Knowledge, because it was all about, his mother was white and his mother was black and his father was white, and how he gradually learned to become educated or read from the son of one of the masters. But Sojourner says, you read, but God himself talks to me. What could be more supreme than that? You may have some knowledge, but God, the ultimate divine leader, he talks to me. So I am, if not your equal, I am above you, is what I felt she was saying. So don't think you're above me.
Well, and he did. He would have looked down on her because it was everything he was trying to fight against. He he wanted to raise up his people through learning and knowledge. He wrote or said later, I don't know if it was attributed to him or he wrote it himself, but he always felt that Sojourner felt it was her job to trip him up.
Oh, yes, she did trip him up many times. Yeah, is it good to talk about Fangwell Hall at this point or no?
Sure, go right ahead.
Okay, at Fangwell Hall, he was totally distressed. I mean, totally stressed out. He felt the only way to end what was going on would be through blood and bloodshed and violence and usage of weapons, of guns, and to stop the slavery thing. And she basically stood up and asked him, is God dead, or is God gone? And it shut him and everybody else. It hushed the audience.
It's been an enduring memory. It's on her memorial marker at Oak Hill Cemetery as well.
Yes, it is. Is God dead? Yes.
And then another person that she met there in Northampton was Olive Gilbert, to whom she would dictate the narrative of Sojourner Truth, and candidly is the reason we're all sitting here tonight. I think everything comes from that document, but it's got some troubles as a historical document. You want to talk a little bit about that, Liz?
Well, the problem is it's dictated to Olive Gilbert, so we have, and it's looking at other things she wrote. It's in her style, so I think she couldn't help herself. She'd start correcting or elaborating or interpreting what Sojourner was telling her along the way. Now, that's always a problem. I mean, in history, with documents, we take what we get.
Yeah.
And I always told my students that when you're an historian, think of it like a courtroom, and you have all the roles. You're the prosecution, you're the defense, you're the jury, and you're the judge. And your witnesses are dead. But you can actually still cross-examine them. The way we do it with Sojourner is just comparing it to what other people said about her or what other people said she said. And there's still consistency to what Sojourner said. There's a consistency to her way of speaking. So you have to just work between the lines. But we know most of what we know about Greek statuary from Roman copies. I mean, this happens all the time in history. It's not unusual.
Yeah.
I would rather have something directly written by Sojourner, but we don't.
So we do what we can. And you're right. Those themes, those consistency really do raise themselves. I wanted to just raise this because this was in it was in the book by Painter about how this narratives were fairly common, and she was inspired by Frederick Douglass's narrative to do this. But what made it different, at least in Painter's point of view, was that unlike other narratives, which really ended with an indictment of the institution of the system of slavery, this ended on a moment of note, and this was a later, I imagine later, her religion not tinctured in the least with gloom, her trust is in God, and she looks from him she looks for good, not evil, and specifically talking about relishing the fact that John DeMott had finally come around to learning that slavery was wrong, and so it was a little bit different than other narratives. But one thing it did do was it enabled Sojourner to realize a lifelong dream, and that would be to have a place of her own. And there you see a house built around the house that she probably lived in Florence. And she stayed on even though the community had dissolved in 1846. And it might have been the end of the story. Even in her writing, Gilbert seems to note that this will help Sojourner in her golden years. I'm making that term up, but really it was the beginning, and this enters into the 1850s where her rhetoric became much sharper, and it seems to make a significant shift, doesn't it, Kimberly? A recognition of more systemic issues as opposed to purely personal issues.
Absolutely. I think knowledge is powerful. And when you know more about the forces at play, and how they're at play to marginalize and dehumanize a sector of humanity, you can't help but be angry.
Yeah.
And I think this is a shift to how can I help inform a collective liberation? So it's not just about my personal journey, but it's about a collective. And I think that's where we start to see this shift.
Yeah. You really start to see her speak at a lot of women's rights meetings, and taking on a much stronger rhetoric. Um, this was a record of her first. I shouldn't say her first, of her speaking at in Worcester, which was the first women's rights meeting of its scale in the country. Um, and then, of course, we have a later. This was her account in Akron, the place of the speech that we all know today as the "Ain't I a Woman" speech. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. That's not what she said. Um, there was a lot of her accounts of speaking are at odds. And Liz, why do you think that is? I mean, what can we believe?
Well, this was a time of great turmoil, and the people that are writing this have their own agendas. The reporters,
Exactly.
the like Olive Gilbert herself, all of the other people that worked with Sojourner. I think part of the reason her speech gets more pointed is that she's learning more from other people too. She's absorbing. I mean, this woman doesn't sit still. Her brain doesn't sit still. She's learning all the time. And so what historians do is just, again, look for consistency. And really the consistency of her speech is fairly, she's other people talk about how witty she is, how pithy she is, how she can take ordinary examples. She speaks to the common person. She knows her Bible. These are all things that are pretty consistent with. So even if we can't always literally know what she said, we do know the style. And don't forget that she knew Dutch until she was 10 and then learned English. So she certainly did not talk like the stereotype of a Southern slave. She didn't sound like Topsy and Uncle Tom's Cabin or Prissy and Gone with the Wind. I mean, that's a very stereotypical style anyway. I doubt if most blacks sounded like that in the first place in the South.
Right. Yeah, and I'm
So,
always careful when I'm pulling quotes, even from sources like a newspaper that are in that vernacular. I feel like I'm perpetuating that stereotype.
yeah, I used to cringe sometimes hearing certain reenactors. They would just assume they had to do it that way.
Yeah,
I mean, this is long ago when this happened, but certainly I think we can tell her style,
yeah,
even if we can't always literally. And Ain't I a Woman? Yeah, we do have a fairly good the reporter that reports it, it's fairly good. I think, and it's not the Ain't I a Woman thing that got written down 10 years later.
10 or
That
12, yeah. So we talked a little bit about just the volume of her voice. I mean, she just had a very commanding voice, very deep voice, which doesn't sit well with some of those quotes that you read from time to time. I wanted to include this because it gets so much attention when she was challenged in speaking. It was in Silver Lakes, Indiana, was it not, Donna, where she
Yes.
was
Yes.
challenged
Yes. She was
on
challenged.
whether she was a woman or not, and she bared her breast to the whole congregation when it was suggested that she show her breast to a couple of women in private. She goes, "No, I do it here, and I do it to your shame, not mine." Why this tack to discredit this speaker? I mean, we talked about this last week. It seems pretty calculated.
It's a common style of attack, I think. If you can't really argue with the speaker, then you try to undermine them somehow.
Mhm.
And Sojourner was very tall.
Yes.
People didn't realize actually the area of Africa that her ancestors came from. Generally, they were quite tall. Um, uh, just a way to, I said, and any woman who took the public stage, I forgot who said this, it might have been Nell Painter, that basically she unsexed herself. Well, she can't be that good. She must be a guy.
Hmm.
I mean,
Mhm.
this kind of backwards logic.
Yeah.
Plus, she didn't fit what would be the Western style of beauty. You know, Toni Morrison talked about that in her writings and her novels, that there was a destructive quality to the idea of beauty in the
Yes.
Western world. Um, and Sojourner didn't fit that either.
Yeah.
There were occasionally, I didn't come, I found one instance where that did happen to a white woman too, where they attacked her and said, well, you must be a guy, you must be a man.
Well, one of the things that occurs to me, and we talked about this as well. We don't have examples exactly like this, but it's a common tactic with our um, contemporary powerful
Sure.
women, always being, you know, criticized for things that men aren't being criticized for, their femininity being questioned or their lack of thereof.
Absolutely. Their appearance, anything, as Liz says, to undermine their credibility and the power of
Mm-hmm.
who they are.
But
Yeah,
but I just want to jump on the end of that. There was more to
sure.
that quote where Sojourner Truth said that she let men who I guess they were stately at this point, but that she let them suckle on her breasts to their statehood.
Yeah,
So in other words, to me, she took the power immediately away.
yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
Yeah,
absolutely.
she had the power. She
Yeah.
suckled these men to
Mm-hmm.
their adulthood.
And I just wanted to put up a couple of quotes. "Aren't I a woman or ain't I a woman?" That was a fiction, really, by Frances Gage, who was at the Akron event, um, and she had written that, uh, at least in my reading, about 10 or 12 years later.
Yeah, about 12.
Yeah, in response to Harriet Beecher Stowe's wild success with the Libyan Sybil in the Atlantic Monthly. Harriet Beecher Stowe, of course, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Um, and it was in that piece of print that that "Is God Dead" quote, I think, first appeared, if I'm to believe the source that I had. Not that it's all that different from "Is God Gone," but there was a lot in that Harriet Beecher Stowe article that was just made up. Um, it wasn't a mistake. It was made up because she was trying to create a story. Um, and I think it's just interesting that, I mean, these were her colleagues and friends, really. These were people that she worked with in the cause, and there was a certain amount of we'll use each other to achieve our ends. At least that's how I kind of interpret it. Anybody want to push back on that?
Well, the abolitionists, I'm talking about the white abolitionists now, looked for people who they thought were good symbols and they would sort of make them fit. I mean, Sojourner by this time was becoming iconic,
Yeah,
becoming very well known, at least throughout the Midwest. And uh, they used that to their purposes. Well, I can't even start thinking of any number of saints that have been twisted the same way
yeah,
to fit an agenda. It's a political agenda, which was abolition and women's rights and any number of other things. And Sojourner, uh, if she didn't quite fit, they just sort of pushed her into fitting.
made it fit. Make it fit. So
Absolutely.
this really gets us into when she really becomes a political force. And by this time, she's already been in Battle Creek, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But she really, she's long already been a powerful speaker, but here she really begins to take on issues of the day. And she would more emerge as a force behind all these issues. So, Kimberly, what were some of the other issues that she spoke of?
Well, she certainly advocated for formerly enslaved people, petitioned for land, working for the Freedmen's Bureau to help connect them with resources. She advocated against capital punishment. She was for the temperance movement. There's so many other causes that she began to advocate for later in life.
Yeah. That's just an amazing quote there in the Boston Liberator. And we're going to move through the slides a little bit more quickly here because this is a long program. This was the account, which kind of goes to what you just said, Kimberly, about advocating for helping free people enter into society in the 1965 issue of Harper's Weekly. And it was also during this time that these images that we see today still, and you can find very easily online. This was another use of technology and media that showed a really innate sense of media savvy. And I don't know who I said I was going to ask about this, but I'll ask all of you. What was the significance of this, and how important was this? Okay, Kimberly, I'll ask you.
Well, it goes back to, there's so many. This could be a whole segment all on its own, Mac. When Donna said Sojourner Truth was a self-made person, I mean, when I speak to younger people, I say, how, and now I'm aging myself, you go to a concert and you get a poster of the person performing. Well, she was way ahead of this game.
Yes.
And she actually had the wherewithal to copyright her image, which is something we don't normally hear about.
Right.
When we talk about Sojourner Truth. So this is a source of income.
Yeah. And just to mention, she didn't meet just one president. She met three. Of course, Abraham Lincoln, we all are probably aware of that if we know the story at all, but also Johnson and Ulysses Grant, and campaigned for Grant. She was a big advocate for bringing African Americans into the war effort. She was very proud of her own son enlisting, or not her son, grandson, right?
Grandson.
Yeah.
So.
Oh yeah, I totally forgot to mention that. I mean, her work there, and I believe here, I'm trying to remember where I heard this story. Hopefully, it's true, where she helped get resources, and they gathered them at, I think, what is now Irma's Travel, in that location. Basic needs goods to take to the Black troops that were waiting to be deployed.
Yep, that happened in Detroit, Michigan, at Camp Ward, 102nd U.S. Division.
Yeah. So we're going to pass over. That's the quote where she testified again in the Michigan legislature against capital punishment. But let's get into Battle Creek. This is why we're here. Extraordinary life. But let's talk a little bit about, this is what Battle Creek looked like in the 1860s. This is McCamley, Maine area, the village of Battle Creek. Liz, talk about how she first came to Battle Creek.
She came at the request of Henry Willis, who was he was a wonderful character. And I wish somebody would write a dissertation on him. But anyway, he was a Quaker who had heard of her and requested that she come and speak. And then the Merritt family, who were also prominent in Battle Creek and were Quakers, Hicksite Quakers, which they were rebellious Quakers. They thought they wanted to be more activist. I mean, it was not enough to say as a Quaker, you're against slavery and I'm going to pray that you're free. You're supposed to do something about it, get involved politically. And so these were a lot younger Quakers, usually too, a younger generation, very activist. And that's how she originally came to Battle Creek. At their request, she stayed at the Merritt Homestead, which is now where Dr. Robinson has his practice on the Capitol.
I have a slide with that. This is her deed in Harmonia, where she also had a house for a spell. For how long? 10 years did she have her home in Harmonia? She was traveling a lot, but this was her home base.
Yes.
And then she did eventually buy her home on College Street. And it was through the Merritts, and that's Charles Merritt there. And you see an older photo of the Merritt house, which still stands at the corner of Capitol and Merritt. It is now a physician's office. She was well. Go ahead, Liz. I'm sorry.
I was going to say the home on College Street, the Merritts also gave her the lumber to build it.
Right.
And it was a home. Sometimes people say she lived in a barn. She did not. The fellow who bought the property later and built a house moved her house back and made it into a barn. But she didn't live in a barn. I mean, it just sort of gets mixed up.
Well, I'm glad I didn't repeat that because I did read that.
Yes, a lot of historians say that.
Yeah, it's not true. It's not. It did become a barn later, but that was a guy named Edward Austin, who was the postmaster in Battle Creek. He bought the property, but he decided to build a bigger house, and so he just pushed that one to the back and made it a barn, and then tore it down. He tore it down.
And here you have a look at where her house is. I actually had a friend recently saying that she was going to go look at the house that Sojourner Truth lived in, and I said, "No, you're not. You're going to where it was." But actually, our good friend Kurt Thornton had provided us these maps and that inset map. She was very well accepted in this community, was she not?
Well, keep in mind, this was a much more, Nell Painter, I think, was the one who said this was the Athens of the Midwest, which you just had a lot of rebellious activity going on here. People who were, as I said, perfectionists, the Second Coming. I mean, these rebellious Hicksite Quakers. I mean, this was just a booming place for ideology and religion.
Yeah. Kurt also provided me these earlier photos of the Methodist Church, not the one that stands today. But I read that she loved the Quakers, but they didn't let her sing, and she would walk by the Methodist Church and hear the singing and go on in herself. And we haven't really touched on that. She had an amazing singing voice.
Yes.
There was one incident, I think it was in Long Island, where the rowdies were descending on the Millerite camp, and they were all hiding in their tents, and she just went out and she started singing, and they all gathered around and said, "Keep singing,"
They had clubs and everything. She thought she was going to be beat down that day. Yeah. But they just wanted to hear her sing.
She loved to sing. And there's an interior of the church, as it would have looked at that time. And she, she had a relationship with Dr. John Harvey Kellogg. What do we know about that relationship? Donna?
Oh, well, I know of one very, very different, somewhat intimate relationship, not sexually, of course not, but of a time where she had lesions, ulcers on her legs, and in particular, this one, she needed a skin graft, and she was at her home on College Street, and her daughters were there, and Dr. Kellogg pulled out these forceps, and when the daughters seen him, they scurried, they literally ran out of the house because they said, "Oh no." Well, he had her all set up for the procedure, so he decided he'd just roll his sleeve up and take a graft of his own white skin and put it in the place that needed to be grafting, and she had a ring of white around her leg for the rest of her life of a couple of years.
She was tickled by that, wasn't she?
Yeah.
Didn't she bring that up from time to time?
Yeah. She was amazing. She's so awesome. I just want to praise her name right now. I'm sorry. I just had to say that.
I'm glad you did. Feel free. Anybody can jump in. Yeah, and actually, Dr. Kellogg, he flirted with spiritualism a little bit as well, didn't he? Isn't that what kind of led to his departure from the church, or am I wrong on that, Liz?
Oh, it's a little more complicated than that, but he got into what is called pantheism too, which really is the Christian church doesn't like that. You know, the idea that God is in everything, in the
Yes.
trees and the hills, etc.
Yes.
He drifted off into a lot of things, but I'm sure that one got him in trouble too.
I'm sure it did too.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then, another relationship, and I always feel like I'm giving everything short shrift, but we do want to get to bed at some point tonight. But a relationship with Francis Thornton. Kimberly, can you speak to that?
Francis Titus.
Yeah, not Francis Thornton.
Whoops. Francis Titus, thank you.
Yeah, actually, I missed what I heard was a wonderful reenactment of Francis Titus.
I missed that as well.
At the Historical Society and Marilyn Strobel. Hopefully, I'll be able to see that again. But these two had a unique relationship, is my understanding, and it was really. I think when you think about sisterhood solidarity, this would be an example of two women coming together in that way. And I don't know, I'm just trying to think of the words to describe this connection, this bond between the two of them.
Well, some of the business stuff that she did, I mean, she was basically her manager. She traveled with her. And she was that word that I asked Liz to pronounce for me, that basically what all of Gilbert was. What was that, Liz? What's that word?
Amanuensis.
Yeah, amanuensis. There, I said it first time.
Amanuensis.
Internet. So she did a lot of work for her, but it seemed to be a far more personal relationship as well. Anything to add to that, Donna?
No, I think you covered quite a bit of it, but you've really got to hear Marilyn. I'm putting a plug in for Marilyn Strobel. She really did her homework, and I don't want to take anything away from her, but she really enacted her.
I feel really bad about missing it. I was busy preparing for this, but
yes.
But and I heard you were pretty good yourself. So.
Oh well, thank you.
And this kind of speaks to just how beloved she was in this community by so many people. I mean, she was frequently called on by local reporters. There were a lot of folks who called her friend. This was at a surprise party for her in 1880 by L.E. Bailey. I'm not really 100% sure who that is, but you can just see, words of wisdom and truth, crisp aphorisms that made Sojourner Truth the remarkable woman that she has become.
Well, this is what historians look for. This is what I meant before when I said her style is described quite consistently, even if we can't always literally know what she said in each case. The style is pretty consistent.
Yeah. And yet, for all that, being an old newspaper man, I look at how decisions are made, and for all that notoriety, she was a nationally acclaimed individual, very famous, and you can find at this point in her life, you can find her quoted or referred to in newspapers all over the country. But when she passed away, and they have the age wrong there at 108. But when she passed away, it was a story inside the newspaper, which to me kind of speaks to, again, that other famous people who died merited front page coverage, but she didn't. And I think that, that says something that, yes, she was well received here, but she was still a Black woman and accorded less importance than other wealthy people.
Well, Yeah, I think it's amazing, her book of life, how so many wealthy white people did write in it and talk about her moral character.
Yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. And so, this is. Oh, I'm getting an echo here. This is an echo, this is an echo. This is a photograph of in the 1930s when the Sojourner Truth, Friends of Sojourner Truth, is that the name of the organization? So many names float around my head, but that's when they had the marker laid. It wasn't the first marker,
No.
uh, but previous markers had worn away. The man on the far right with the hat on is Claude Evans, for whom a park in Battle Creek is named. Um, but there had been various efforts through the years to improve that. Um, and then, of course, in 1999, it took more than 100 years, but we finally had our memorial um, in Battle Creek. This, Donna, you were there.
Yes, yes. I just want to say, Mac, I just want us to remember Tina Allen, who was the
Yes.
sculptress of this monument, who sadly enough died, what was it, about 5, 6 years
Yeah.
ago from a
Yeah.
massive heart attack.
Yeah.
So whoever's watching this program, I highly advise, if you can ever come to Battle Creek, you will be greeted by her when you enter the city, and to really come and see what she built, her legacy.
Yeah. It was
I
quite an effort to have that. As I remember, I was brand new in this community at the time, but that was the culmination of a long effort, was it not?
Oh,
Oh,
yes.
geez. Yes.
Yeah. And it's hard to imagine downtown without it now.
Right.
When I came here, I went straight over to the cemetery because I knew that I had heard of Sojourner Truth in graduate school already, incorrectly because of the anti-woman speech. But one time, a Brownie troop, the Historical Society had a Brownie troop, and they asked me to talk about Sojourner. I said, well, let's go over to the cemetery. So we're talking, and this car comes inching by very slowly, and I turn, and it was a green Jaguar, so I knew it was Velma Clay. And I turned, and Velma said, oh, we don't want to bother you. I said, Velma, I'm talking to these girls about how Sojourner was a model and a mentor. And I said, you're another one. You just drove up. And I couldn't have planned this. And guess who she had in the car? Tina Allen.
Wow.
And they
Oh,
got out and talked. I said, talk to the girls. And Tina had cards that she autographed for the girls. I mean, I never
Oh,
could have
wow.
planned this. It was a wonderful serendipitous uh,
wonderful.
event. And these were from the Brownie troop from Verona School that we
Oh,
sponsored. That was wonderful. Um,
oh, that's great. I like this painting because you're so used to seeing her. I'm not going to say the drab colors of the dark green and the black but these vibrant colors, and the
mhm.
truth, is so powerful, and it prevails.
Yeah,
Outstanding job by the artist.
yeah, I
Yeah.
like that.
I love Jorge's comment. When will Battle Creek rename Truth City? There you go.
Amen.
So this on this, and we all know who that person is.
Oh my goodness, the days of reenactment
There
as
you are.
Yes.
Miss Truth herself.
If,
Um,
if it weren't so late, I would ask you to reenact something now, Donna. But I do
I,
want to talk.
I'll
Go
just
ahead.
say a few words.
Okay.
If women want rights any more than what they got, just take them and not be talking about it.
That's great. Thank you. I wanted to turn to Kimberly as we wind up here. This is a big year for the Sojourner Truth Center for Liberation and Justice, and one of the things I had in my notes to mention before is that Sojourner Truth really has become, I think, more and more well known over the past couple of decades. There's more and more people discovering that power, and then the former Sojourner Truth Center has a new plan and a new name. What's in store, Kimberly? What's the future?
Yes, the future is exciting. Uh, we mentioned Dr. Velma Laws Clay. She founded the Sojourner Truth Institute of Battle Creek, and I had the privilege of working with her in her later years and talked with her about her vision. We talked with the community about what the next, journey or evolution of the Institute would be. And we decided two things. One, we absolutely needed to build on the foundation that Dr. Clay led, her vision to really amplify the legacy and story of Sojourner Truth. But two, to truly honor her would be to pick up the baton and carry on the work. And so that is the other piece that we're really excited to usher in this new year, rooted in Sojourner Truth's legacy as our model for advocacy, activism, and liberation. We're excited. We're excited to build on the work that Dr. Clay started. We're excited to partner with Willard Library and Liz, and Donna's on our board, so she has no choice. Really,
yay, I love it.
I think Battle Creek has a really great opportunity to really amplify Sojourner Truth's story. This tonight is just the beginning.
Yeah. Well, I'm proud to be a part of it. I appreciate the three of you indulging me to cover such a wide breadth of Sojourner Truth's life. I know that it was, it's a lot to cover, and we're pushing on 2 hours. And but to me, it was a story that people just don't hear enough, and I learned so much just reading the books, and it's so powerful. And again, I appreciate your help. I appreciate your wisdom. Appreciate your knowledge, and I appreciate your commitment to moving forward with this, Donna and Kimberly. You both, but I know that you are a great steward of Battle Creek's history as well, Liz, and a number of other people, Marilyn and her work, the Historical Society. So I'm looking forward to more and more people knowing our story as a community and the people who came here. And this is an important part of it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Any other last words? Anybody? I don't want to leave anybody hanging.
Well, we really appreciate the fact that you took this on. And believe me, you have taken it on. And these women are powerful. Just know that.
It's really a complex story. It's nothing simple. There's so many different aspects to it to really get a good grip on Sojourner. But just to start with understanding that she was a preacher filled with the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, thank you. I'd be remiss if I didn't say, if you wanted to learn more, there are great books and resources at Willard Library. Not just biographies that we have, but also children's books. Barbara Allen, descendant of Sojourner Truth, her book, children's book, is at the library. We talked about having other descendants here. It was logistically difficult, health-wise and otherwise, but there's a lot still to learn. I put up sojournertruth.org. You can contact the Sojourner Truth Center and learn more. So again, thank you, everybody, and thank you to those viewers who had stuck with us for almost 2 hours. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Good night, audience. Panelists, stay with me until we get off the air.
Okay.
All right. Good night, everybody.